Oh, hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Ilaria Parodi of the International Schools team at Pearson, and I would like to extend you a very warm welcome to today's webinar on global politics for the IB Diploma Program. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to draw your attention to the slide on the screen. Michael, if you could move to the next slide, that would be great, thank you. The next slide outlines some of the house rules for today's webinar. If you could just take a few moments to familiarize yourself with the rules, that'd be great. A couple of things to notice. If you need to communicate with us, if you're experiencing any technical issues, etc., and you need assistance, please use the chat box. We'll keep it monitored throughout the webinar and we'll aim to resolve any issues for you. If you would like to pose questions on today's webinar, please use the chat box. We'll obviously keep an eye on it. There'll be time for questions at the end of the webinar. Today's webinar is scheduled to last for about 40 to 50 minutes. It's being recorded. Recordings will be available in the next few days from our website. We will email you with a link to the recording where it's placed on our website so that you'll be able to watch it again should you wish to do so, or maybe share it with your colleagues. And now, without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker for today's webinar. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Michael O'Shaughnessy. Dr. Michael O'Shaughnessy is the head of global studies at UWC-SEA in Dover, Singapore. Michael has a PhD in international relations from the Australian National University. He's an examiner for the Global Politics Paper 2. He has also been an examiner for the IA engagement activity. He has been involved extensively in helping develop the latest IB Global Politics curriculum. And now, without further ado, I'm handing the time over to Michael for the start of our webinar. Michael, over to you.
Great, thanks, Ilaria. Thanks for that. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I've got everything worked out. I'm just going to start the timer so I don't waffle on too much. Greetings from Singapore. On behalf of my co-authors, Carolina Chavez Fregoso and Stephen Adingnost, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to go through some of the major changes to the IB Global Politics revision or the guide, and then also some of the ways in which the book that the three of us have created can help with the teaching and learning of the new iteration of the IB Global Politics Guide. A little bit, so I'm going to move to the next thing. As Ilaria said, I am currently at Singapore. Just a little bit of a background, my journey to global politics actually took maybe a slightly different path than many of us, is that I actually came in through examining to begin with. So I was fortunate enough, I think probably 2014, to be one of what was then a very small group of paper 2 examiners. And that's where I really was introduced to global politics through that route. And then since then, obviously that group of examiners has become significantly larger. I was fortunate enough a few years back to have the opportunity to teach IB Global Politics. Most of my teaching career, which is nearly 22 years now, I've actually been an IB economics teacher. So like many of us, I think, as I've come into global politics through a different Group 3 course within the IB. Having said that, my passion has always been global politics. Most of my postgraduate work is in international relations. And so when I had an opportunity to teach global politics, I grabbed it with both hands. And certainly in moving to Singapore here at UWC, I've really thrived being in that situation again. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a background there. The agenda for today is to very quickly provide some context. I'm a big fan of providing context in global politics for the changes to the syllabus, then to talk a little bit about teaching and learning as far as the new syllabus is concerned. a quick talk about assessment, and then a little bit on how the DP textbook that the three of us have created aligns with the subject guide. And finally, hopefully to leave enough time for some of your questions and answers, because honestly, I think that's probably the most valuable bit of these webinars, is to kind of see what questions you have and to hopefully answer them as best I can. All right. So what we need to keep in mind, a little bit of historical context here, is that global politics is still a relatively new IB course. It only went mainstream in 2015. We're actually a little bit late for our the next iteration of our guide, but of course the pandemic, as it did in so many ways, kind of halted progress. And also to recognize that in its current form, it was actually built upon a set of school-based syllabi. So it's always had, I hesitate to use the term Frankenstein's monster because I think it was way more elegant than that, although it was no less complex than I think Frankenstein's monster was. And you can see this probably most clearly in the fact that there are 16 key concepts, which is quite a lot of key concepts for any single course. And what I'll talk about in a minute is the ways in which I think through the revision process, IB Global Politics will now have a much clearer identity as its own subject. And then the other thing to note is, as I alluded to just a moment ago, is that we've seen an exponential growth in both student numbers and also the number of schools that are offering global politics. And this really speaks to the fact, I think, that there was a gap in the group threes. And this is a course that is resonating with students and schools around the world. And it is my hope, and this is where I kind of see it going, is that the course is only going to grow over the next 7 years of this course. So a little bit about the course revision. So as I said, I think one of the main things is that there's been a much more deliberate effort from the IB to create, to cultivate a stronger sense of identity as a distinct subject in its own right. And one of the things that the IB has kind of has clearly stated is that there are three elements that drove the revision process: this focus on flexibility, inquiry, and engagement. And I'll talk a little bit more about these. I'll return to these three kind of elements throughout the rest of my presentation now, but I'd like to make some initial observations. In terms of flexibility, we can see this in the design of the course, as well as in some of the materials that the IB has shared or will share shortly with students. And so it's this idea that there are multiple ways in which to approach the course. And I think even more than that, although the IB can't dictate how we teach the course, I think they would really love it if that teachers and students were involved in co-designing how the course is taught and learned within classrooms around the world. Inquiry, as we will see, is at the heart of the global politics course. And I think there's also this explicit emphasis on systems thinking. And we see this in some of the diagrams that are in the course that I'll show in slides in a moment. In terms of making those interconnections between different parts of the course, and in particular, as we'll see, between concepts, content, and content. That is also then reflected in the structure of many of the assessment components. And then engagement. And I don't think that this is anything new with global politics. I think global politics has always been about engaging students. And I think, in fact, many students come to global politics already kind of, in a sense, pre-engaged, right? They're really interested in learning more about the world around them and why it's certain ways and not other ways. And, how do we conceptualize these different kind of key concepts within global politics? And so I think what the course actually does is it really leans into that engagement, and we can see it in so many different ways. So anyway, I go through some of that. I think the other thing I really want to kind of highlight, and this is something I also come back to in a later slide, is I think we're fortunate in global politics. Well, I see it as being fortunate, is that there's way more scope for educator and learner agency than exists in many of the other Group 3 subjects. And I'm speaking as a former economics teacher. Is the IB Economics Guide, for those of you who are familiar with it, and I'd be interested to hear for those of you who are coming out of geography or out of history, very prescriptive in that these are the things that you need to hit. Whereas in global politics, I think we have much more scope to really kind of go down different paths. We all end up in the same place, but there's much more flexibility in how we go about teaching what we teach. So a little bit more in this systems thinking. For anyone who is taught or is teaching a Group 3 subject that has recently gone through a revision process, this image will look familiar. I know there was something very similar in the most recent economics guide, which I taught for a year before I moved to Singapore. And also, I think like the DT guide, they have something very similar, this kind of this diagram where we see the interrelationships between context, concepts, and content. And at the heart, we have this real focus on inquiry. And I would like to see this as, if I'm reading between the lines, as part of a broader realization on the part of the IB that the world's problems cannot be resolved through a singular approach. And in fact, what we need more of are multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary approaches in order to make more sense, and in order to be able to come up with some possible solutions for many of the challenges that we currently face. And then this idea that inquiry is at the heart of everything we and our students should be doing in global politics. So the syllabus reframed. I'm not really going to go too much into this because I think we can glean a lot of these changes just by looking at the guide, and these diagrams and the ones that follow are all just taken from the IB guide. But what we can see are some subtle but significant shifts. In the first place, we've cut the 16 key concepts down to 4. It doesn't mean that the other 12 have disappeared. It's just that they've been incorporated into the thematic studies, as we'll see. And then one of the other kind of shifts is this movement away from 4 separate units into a core topics, and then these 3 thematic studies. And I think that shift from talking about Unit 1, which is generally being described as the foundational unit in the current guide, and shifting that to a core. And I think of foundational in a very much in a construction sense, that you lay a foundation before you build on top of it. And so the implication is you have to do the foundation first. And one of the reasons I think for shifting towards speaking about core topics is that you don't necessarily have to do them first. And it's not a case of you do them and then they're done. It's a case that the core topics are now integrated through the entire course. And we're constantly referring back to them and building upon them or drawing up from them as we move through the course. So no longer reflects again that diversity and approach to teaching and learning. I think we also see some small but significant changes to the engagement, the internal assessment, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then finally, the global political challenges. We've gone from 6 to 8 by adding in both technology and equality. And I'll talk a little bit more about the HL extensions in a moment as well. And then on the right, we see further evidence of this kind of systems thinking approach in the way that the IB would ideally like us to teach the course, is that you have everything interweaving and overlapping and working together rather than these distinctly separate kind of components. So what this leads to is multiple approaches to teaching and learning. And if you look at the teacher support material that the IB has provided, they outline 3 possible options. This is not exhaustive. There are I've seen 5 or 6 different ways of teaching global politics, and I think we can really mix and match. The bottom line, and I'll say this at the end, but I think it's worth saying now and then repeating at the end, is there's no right or wrong way to structure a global politics class. And we all have to be cognizant and aware of our unique and particular situations in terms of, the role or the place of global politics within our schools, the composition of our teams. Are you teaching it by yourself? Are you teaching with other teachers? Where are they coming from? And also with our students as well. And we need to really kind of mold our approach to teaching global politics to best fit our particular context. So I'm going to quickly outline the 3 that the IB has talked about, and then I'm going to quickly talk about mine and perhaps provide a rationale for the way I'm currently imagining I will teach the course in August this year. So the first one is teach global politics what I suppose would be called the traditional way. And there's nothing wrong with this. This is something that the IB recognizes because There may be some among you who are going to be teaching IB Global Politics for the first time in August, or if you're a November school in early 2025. There may be some of you who are watching this as a recording and have turned up at your school in late July or early August and have been told, hey, guess what? You're teaching IB Global Politics next week or the week after you want to prepare. So there is nothing wrong with starting with the core topics and then following with each of the 3 thematic studies in turn. Nothing wrong with that at all. Option 2 is to teach the 3 thematic studies in turn and then incorporate the core topics within each, drawing on the relevant sections or the relevant components of the core topic as you need them to help your students make sense of each of the 3 thematic studies. The third one, and I suspect they're never going to say it explicitly, but I suspect that this is what the IB would like us to do, is to adopt a case study approach by creating 4 to 6 case studies, each of which incorporates a core topic. And then the case studies will be connected to more than one thematic study. Ideally, each case study would be connected to all 3 thematic studies, although that would be quite a challenging task. The way I'm going to do it is this option 4, which is a bit of a hybrid, and I'll explain why in a moment. But I'm imagining that I'm going to teach the core topics in a traditional fashion, and then adopt a case study approach for the remainder of the course. And my reason for this is that in my particular context, I'm the only global politics specialist. The other teachers in my team are coming from other subjects, and I really don't want this shift to be too much of a shock to their system. And I'm also thinking that that my kids, what we often see is with grade 11 students coming into global politics, it's really their first exposure to the course, and they're not really familiar with it. And I want to ease them in. And at the same time, I'm suspecting that most of my students coming out of grade 10 are not familiar with a case study approach to the degree that I would like them to be later on in the course. And so I want to be able to introduce this methodological approach, slowly. And then what this also does is it provides an opportunity for me to be able to co-design the course with my students, because I'll have a semester for me to get to know them and for them to get to know me. And I'm hoping that this will help in terms of an active buy-in. And then where the other little bit of kind of difference to the option 3 is that I'll create probably 6 case studies. We will only cover 3 to 4, and this allows, again, that flexibility, is that to negotiate with my class of which 3 to 4 case studies do they want to study over the next, year and a bit. And then it allows me to leave space at the end of the course, towards the end of grade 12 before they go to their IB exams, and this is my thinking, to have them actually develop a case study collaboratively of their own. So a chance to practice some of those soft skills of collaboration and also creativity, but to give them the flexibility to pursue a topic, a case study that they are interested in. Because I might try as best I can to create 6 case studies that are diverse, that touch different parts of the world and different topics and all that kind of stuff, but I'm still going to miss something that a set of kids or a number of kids are going to be interested in doing. So I'd like to have that little bit of flexibility. Now, I recognize that we're not all going to be in the same place. And so, we all have to do what works best for us. So the HL topic areas, as I said, we have expanded them from 6 to 8 with the addition of technology and equality. And then again, with this diagram taken from the IB guide, we see further evidence of that systems thinking. All right, of the really emphasizing the interconnections between the global political challenges rather than dealing with them each separately. And this is something that then gets reflected in the new paper 3 that I'll talk about in a moment. So assessment, as I said. Again, I'm not really going to go through this too much because I think a lot of this we can glean from the guide and the teacher support material. But a couple of quick comments. As I think we probably all realize now, paper 1 is the least changed from the old to the new syllabus. It's still a source-based paper. It's still 4 questions. The questions really haven't changed in terms of their nature, although there is a change with question 3 and question 4 in terms of the marks available. So question 3 is dropping from 8 marks to 6 marks, and so students are required to do less with that. And then question 4 is expanding from 10 to 12. So, you know, there'll be something, we'll have to train kids in terms of time management as far as paper one, but it's still roughly the same as what we're doing now. The other significant change is that paper one is going to be focused on the core topics. So a little bit different than now, where paper ones can be drawn from any of the 4 units. Paper two is also relatively unchanged. Probably the most refreshing thing is it's no longer a 2 3/4 hour paper, which more than anything was just an exercise in endurance for the HL students at least. And now it's dropping to 1 hour and 45 minutes. It's exactly the same for SL and HL. The other significant difference, it's now split into 2 different sections. So we have a part A where there are 3 questions. Each question is clearly grounded in one of the thematic studies. And then part B, which is what we're now calling integrating questions. And each question basically requires a student to draw upon 2 separate thematic studies in order to answer the question. This is actually not different. This is actually no different than what has appeared in paper 2. For probably the last 5 or so years, it's been the case that in each of the dyads, I suppose, is one of the questions in each of the units was clearly located in that unit. And then the other question was a crossover question in that it drew from that unit and then one of the other 3 units. I guess the difference now is that students are being forced to answer one in-unit question and one integrating question, whereas in the past, they didn't actually have to do that. There is also, and I'm speaking as an examiner now, another significant change in that the rubric, thank goodness, has changed. We're going from 25 marks now to 15, and some of the level descriptors have also changed, which my hope is this then opens up that top mark band, which will be 13 to 15 marks now, and make it much more accessible to students than the current top mark band. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit in the Q&A if you like. What's the other major change? Sorry, just wait, I was going to find where I am in my notes. The other major changes within the IAA rubric, and again, it's one of those kind of subtle but significant changes in the way it's described. So it's no longer an engagement activity, but it's an engagement project, and that has a very different feel. And we see this in some of the assessment criteria for the engagement project, that there's a little bit more of a focus on the process and not just on kind of an analytical evaluative report. And then the other significant change for HL students, and this is kind of, again, leaning into that engagement, is that HL students will now have an extra 400 words to propose a policy recommendation, to advocate for a policy or a strategy or something like that. And this is something that we see in other HL subjects. So again, I'm speaking as a former economics teacher, but the policy paper in paper 3 was essentially asking HL students to do something similar. And I think this is a really positive shift from the IB. It's kind of, in a way, I think it's kind of paraphrasing a quote from Marx that, you know, it's not enough for HL students to interpret the world. The point is that they should be trying to change it. And this is one of those ways in which they can kind of advocate for a change. And something we also see in the paper 3. And that is the most significant change for HL students, is this introduction of a paper 3 to replace the HL oral extensions. The nice thing is it still keeps with the case study approach that we see with the current presentations, but we see more of the systems thinking. I think one of the things, I don't know what it's like for experienced teachers, but one of the things that frustrates my current students and my former students is that with the HL presentations, they're kind of required to pretty much stay within a single global political challenge. What the paper 3 is now explicitly requiring them to do is to make some of those interconnections. So again, we're seeing that kind of systems thinking. It is a stimulus-based paper, and I think there's some training that is going to have to be done with students, and I imagine with some teachers. I'm kind of thinking through this myself, of the difference between a source and a stimulus. And the main thing is that students in a paper 3 are not actually required to use the stimulus in the same way that they are required to use the sources in paper 1. The stimulus is just there to get them thinking. I think what's perhaps still a little confusing is that if we look at the paper 3 specimen, the stimulus there looks not too dissimilar than something we might see as a source in paper 1. I think ideally the IB would like to use kind of less paper 1-ish looking things for a stimulus in the paper 3, but this is something that maybe we'll see in the future. I know in some development meetings, we were talking about kind of using like social media, using tweets and things like that as a stimulus. And again, in the second question, part B in the paper 3, there's a requirement for HL students to advocate for or to recommend a particular policy or strategy. So mirroring the additional task in the engagement activity. So finally, how does our book, the book that the 3 of us create, help you and your students? And I think there's a number of things here. In the first place, and this is how we get the tick of approval from the IB, is the content of the book is matched to and clearly aligns with the IB guide for the first examinations in 2026, and the chapters follow the structure of the guide. The book has been designed that students and yourselves can explore topics at their own pace and according to their own interests. So we don't need to read the book in a strict linear order. Earlier chapters do not need to be read in order to understand later chapters. Although what we have done, and we're kind of mirroring that systems approach, is that throughout the chapters, there are connections made to other parts of the book. So you can see where things kind of fit together. In addition to the chapters on the core topic and the thematic studies, we have a separate chapter that covers each of the assessment components, both in terms of what students are expected to do, as well as providing some guidance, some rather specific guidance that students might take on board as they approach their assessments. On top of that, there are separate chapters for the HL extension topics. So we cover each of those in an entirely separate chapter. There is a separate chapter for linking TOK to global politics. And then finally, there is also a separate chapter for writing an extended essay in global politics and providing some guidance if students decide to do that. So we're really trying to get, all the little bits of the IBDP into the book. There is also an extensive glossary because, I know my students are going to be coming into global politics and not really going to have a familiarity with much of the terminology and jargon that we use in global politics. And so we've really worked hard, the 3 of us, to create kind of a set of concise and precise definitions so that students can refer to that quite easily. We've done our best to model the sort of critical thinking and synthesis that the IB expects from students. In terms of kind of, we don't really have all the answers, but and we're trying to model different ways of approaching different topics and different contexts and different concepts throughout the book. And we've worked hard to ensure that the textbook is as accessible to as many students as possible while still retaining the rigor that the IB generally demands of its students. There are heaps of features, and this is one of the ways in which we've tried to make it accessible. The heaps of features throughout the books in terms of not only do we have those separate chapters, but throughout the book we have TOK boxes where we're making links to TOK like on the actual page. We also do the same thing with HL themes. So rather than just dealing with the HL themes, the GPCs in a separate chapter, we're making those links throughout the book. So again, this kind of systems thinking mirrored throughout the book. There are, key facts and concept questions. I've had to write a list for all these. Concept questions, hints for success. So we're kind of talking about, when we introduce some content, we're talking about how you might use this in a paper 1 or a paper 2 or a paper 3. Some interesting facts. We have cases and real world examples. Sorry, my cleaners are just about to come in. And then also a series of activities where students can kind of practice what they've learned. And finally, and I think maybe this is one of the things that we're most proud of, is we've really taken the global and global politics to heart. One of the core or the centerpieces of the IBDP is this focus on international mindedness. And we would like to think that by injecting as much diversity as we could in terms of focus, approach, and examples, that we're encouraging kind of global mindedness. And with that, I'm going to end and open up for questions and answers. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you all have to say. So thank you.
Yes, Michael, we got a question from Katerina, and the question is, how do questions in section A, paper 2, different from section B? The unit specific / integrating questions do not work now, as most questions are basically integrating. Can you give an example of both?
Yeah, I could. I wish I had the specimen paper that I think the IB has already released, but it's a case of so for instance, if we were doing one grounded within the unit. So I think one of the ones for the human rights at the moment is it talks about how contested notions of rights affect the implementation or the practice of human rights in global politics. So that's very much within that unit. You do not need to go into development and sustainability or peace and conflict to answer that question. You could, there's nothing stopping you from doing that, but there's no requirement. And I think when the mark scheme comes out, you'll see in the mark scheme that's provided to examiners and then released to schools later on down the line, unfortunately, I think you have to buy them, is you'll see that there's no requirement. So that would be a case of, how do contested notions of rights or contested conceptualizations of rights affect the practice of human rights within global politics? An integrating question, the ones that appear in section B, very clearly a signposting, you need to draw from the rights and justice chapter or unit, as well as from development, sustainability, or peace and conflict. So it could be something like universal human rights are necessary for positive peace to be achieved. So you've clearly got a bit that's been taken out of peace and conflict and a bit that's been taken out of the rights and justice, and you need to deal with both of those if you're going to score highly. Yeah, I'm sorry. I really do wish I had the specimen paper 2 in front of me, but that's where I would also direct you. But thank you for your question.
Thank you, Michael. And I have a question from Karen. I'm a new teacher in the IB, currently going through my first IB MYP certification. I have no master's right now. How would you suggest me to move towards ADP global politics? How much of a scope do I have there as a new teacher? I know it's a long way to think about moving to IBDP, but does global politics have scope? My school currently does not offer global politics.
Yeah, I've never taught in an MYP school, and so I can't really speak to that. I do think MYP, this is because it's all part of, you're bought into the entire system. I do think MYP students are slightly better positioned to go into the DP. They're much more prepared in terms of what the DP is going to ask them to do. I'd be kind of curious as to what group 3 subjects your school currently offers students. As I think I said, and I'm biased, I'm obviously biased, is I think the beauty of global politics is that it is far less prescriptive. And I think one of the nice things about the guide now is they've provided more detail to the prescribed content, but it is still relatively prescription light, right? There are things you have to cover, but there's so much scope within them as to how you approach them so that you can actually kind of mold it for your context and for your students' needs that I don't think exist in a lot of the other group 3 subjects. So it tends to attract students who are after that kind of flexibility. So I'm not 100% sure if I'd answer your question. Of course, the simple answer in terms of preparing as a new teacher to global politics is to buy this book. But I think also the IB, there's a lot of professional development opportunities and category 1, especially for new teachers, where they really go through the nuts and bolts, and they are super helpful. I've done them for other subjects, and I would strongly recommend those as well.
Thank you, Michael. I have a question from Joseph. Could you explain more of an AI and EE in global politics?
Yeah, so the internal assessment, so AI in my mind gives me something else, right? I'm trying to think of ChatGPT, which could be one of the interesting things that students could do for their global political challenge now that we've brought technology in. It is one of the HL extension topics. So the IA, the idea is that you have to do an engagement project. So you're planning out a project in which you are it's basically kind of a localized case study on a political issue. So the way the IB defines a political issue is it's typically about the distribution of and practices associated with power within a social organization. So it's really broad. So there's a lot of things that qualify as a political issue. And it's usually not hard for students to find the political issue in something they're interested in. But typically, it's something that they're going to be, that they're interested in. And this is the thing that the IA and the EE share in common, is I'm always trying to get students, you tell me what you're interested in, and we'll work out the rest of it from there. And that's another beautiful thing about global politics. It's such a broad subject. It's actually very interdisciplinary. And so you can really bring in all these different bits into both a GLOPO, IA, and an EE. But the main difference between the two is that an IA requires an active engagement. So you actually have to do something firsthand. So basically primary data. There are a whole range. You can see them in the guide. There are a whole range of different kinds of things that students can do as an engagement. It's not exhaustive by any means, but there's a good number of things there. But basically, they have to do something firsthand. With the EE, while ideally students should be collecting some primary data, it's not explicitly required. And also, the main difference between the EE and the IA is the EE is, well, for SL students, it'd be twice as long. And for HL students, it's an extra 1,600 words. So it's a much more in-depth process. But essentially, they're relatively similar. The thing to keep in mind is that whatever a student does for their IA, they can't also do the same topic for their extended essay. The IB does not allow what they call double dipping. Just keep that in mind.
Thank you, Michael. I have a question from Jacobus. Is it 2 HL extension topics?
Yes, the short answer is at least 2. Yes, they need to be able to make connections, interconnections between 2 of them in their paper 3. So it's kind of not too dissimilar than what they are currently doing. So if you're teaching it currently, and I don't know if that's the case with you, is they have to do 2 separate ones, but they're not actually required to do interconnections between the 2. Now with the paper 3 is they're actually required to make interconnections. This doesn't mean that they only have to do 2. They could potentially do more than 2, although you have to keep it manageable so that there is a degree of depth to their understanding of the topic that they can actually apply it effectively in the paper 3. I mean, I will be fully transparent here. I'm in the same boat as a lot of you as far as what exactly the paper 3 is going to look like and how it's going to be assessed. We've got the specimen paper, so that gives us something. But until we start to see what students actually do, it's going to be interesting to see how it gets assessed. And I know there are a lot of subject-specific kind of seminars going on right now that are preparing teachers for the new syllabus. I know that we all can't go to them. I'm not going to be able to attend one myself, but hopefully some of that information kind of filters through whatever kind of networks we have, and we start to get a clearer sense. But really, it's going to be interesting that first May session to see how the paper 3 pans out.
Thank you. I have more questions. One that says, you mentioned that there are HL links throughout the text. How can teachers use these to support students in the lesson?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about HL students here for the most part, but it's a case of, like, ideally, and again, this is going to depend on how your classes, how your timetable is structured. So for me, I see SL students twice a week and I see HL students 3 times a week. And hopefully, we'll see how it works next year. I'm not in charge of timetabling, is that the classes are separate. This year, I have integrated mixed SL, HL classes, and that's a little bit more of a challenge. Because so much of the content is common between them, right? There's no real difference between HL and SL content. It's just that HL students are required to do more in-depth case study research on particular topics. So the way we're thinking about using those HL topics is just reminding students that they should constantly be making connections to HL themes. And the idea is that, relatively early on in the process, for an HL class, you've introduced the 8, I have to get used to that, the 8 global political challenges, and you're having them start to think about that this is not something which is done at one part of the course, and that's where the HL extension occurs. As much as possible, and again, it's all this kind of systems thinking and the more flexible approach to teaching and learning that the IB is trying to encourage here, is that the HL topics and the HL kind of case study, building up the case studies, should be woven through the course. And so what we've tried to do in the book is to highlight some parts that, hey, if you're interested in the HL topic of identity or in borders or in technology, this particular bit of content or these particular contexts, you can start to make those connections. Now, we don't make the connections for the kids in terms of, well, this is exactly how this particular bit of content fits this particular HL topic, because we want to leave it up to the students to make those connections. We're just flagging that a connection is possible.
Thank you. I have another question that says, although there isn't a strict order that you have to walk through the book, do you have a recommended order?
I'm afraid I'm going to give a fairly unsatisfying answer to this. I think it depends on your particular makeup of students, and it depends on how comfortable you're feeling with the course. You don't have to do the order. I know right now you see the way it's right now is like Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3, Unit 4, and I think we're trained as human beings to go what's that, cardinal, ordinal, to go 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? I don't actually do that right now, simply because I find peace and conflict. So I actually do 1, 2, 3, 4. You can do them in any order. And honestly, I would say do what you're strongest with first and go with that. So for me personally, and again, this is just made up due to the structure of my team, because I have like a geographer, I have a historian, I have an instructional coach. I'm the only global politics person. They're all excellent teachers, but it's just a case of, look, that's not their priority. And I fully understand that. So I want to, lead people into it as much as I can, and also where my students are. So I will start with the core topics and provide that kind of basic understanding of the framework of global politics and how we actually frame our understanding of what I call big G, big P global politics and small g, small p global politics. And then to move into the thematic studies. Now, my passion is rights and justice, so that's what I will probably start with in terms of. Well, actually, no, I'm going to go a case study approach, but I will probably, hoping that my class picks one of the case studies that deals with rights and justice, and I will pick that one to start off with. But it may also be that external events help pick that first case study for me as well, in terms of what's actually happening in the outside world. And is, in this case study I've developed, has there been kind of a recent development that students are already kind of keyed into? And so that then drives, right? So as much as possible, and I admit I'm a little bit more familiar with the course, is trying to co-design it with my students. And that might vary from class to class. Right? Just because I've chosen, like I said, 4 to 6 case studies, it doesn't mean that each class is going to pick the same 3 to 4 case studies that they're interested in. And so there is a degree of flexibility, which is both daunting, and I admit, can be a little bit anxiety inducing, but it's also, I find it as a teacher, very exciting, right? One of the things I love about global politics is I rarely teach the same thing year in, year out. Some of the essentials, of course, stay the same, some of the concepts and some of the basic ideas and terminology, but quite often the things I use to teach global politics will change from year to year because the world changes.
Exactly. There's a question for Joseph in chat, and it says, must I link my lesson topics with TOK all the time? Is there an easy way of letting learners link TOK with all the topics they interact with?
Yeah, I mean, the TOK chapter that we have in the book will help highlight some of the ways in which global politics can be linked to TOK, and I haven't taught TOK. I used to be a TOK teacher in a previous life. I haven't taught the new guide, so I'm a bit hesitant to say anything so definitive. But I know that there is an option, I think, within TOK now, in terms of that's politics and knowledge. And so that's the obvious link. What I would always do is, unless you are a TOK teacher, I'm not, is I would always be flipping it back to the kids. They're the ones who are taking TOK, is get them to articulate some of the connections that they can make, rather than you making all the connections. We do in our textbook, we not only have the TOK chapter, but we also regularly through each of the separate chapters where we're making connections to TOK as well, and just getting them to think. But most of our connections to TOK are in questions that encourage the student to make the connections for themselves.
There is another question from Yakovos, who's asking whether we can still use Kirsch's book for enrichment.
Yeah, I have Max's book, Max. I have a lot of respect for Max because he was right at the heart of this, right stuff. He was the first chief examiner for global politics, and a lot of getting global politics off the ground is due to Max. So with that in mind, Max is he was a cultural or social anthropologist, I think, and you can really get a sense of that through reading the original Oxford book. There are certainly some parts of that are valuable, but I dip into it rarely, and I do use it sometimes if I've got a student who's gone down a particular, particularly in terms of like marginalized communities and things like that. And I think that was Max's strength. So like yes and no, but it's like any textbook for me now. Like I have a whole series of textbooks that I've kind of collected over the years. And it's you dip into them as you need to, or you kind of direct students to them as you need to. I wouldn't necessarily rely on it to structure an IB Global Politics course anymore. I think the course itself has moved on from that text.
Thank you, Michael. There's a question from Lauren, and the question is, I see that there is still no double dipping allowed in the CAS EE engagement activities for project need to be separate. I wonder what the rationale for that is, only because researchers in university will become experts in a topic and all their activities will be centered on the topic. I wonder why IB students are expected to keep their engagement CAS EE so separate and not linked in any way.
Yeah, now I can't speak on behalf of the IB. I'm not a representative of the IB. So I don't know the exact reason. I also find it frustrating, particularly when it comes to not so much the CAS, but when it comes to the EE and the IM. What I tell my kids, and it's interesting, I've just introduced the engagement activity, as we're still calling it, with my current grade 11s, who will be the last ones to go through it in its current iteration. And I have global politics is a relatively popular EE subject here at my school. And so I do have some students who are doing, let's say, refugees, right? They're doing something with refugees for their IA, and they want to do something with refugees for their EE. Now, for me, that's not double dipping because that is a huge topic. I think where the IB identifies as double dipping is if you are basically plagiarizing yourself. If you're using the exact same case study or using the exact same material for both. But even there, I think if you're using the same methodological approach, I mean, it's where do we actually draw that line that it becomes double dipping? I don't think it's as clear a line, and I think we need to be careful about quashing student interest and passion in a topic. I think that's, for me, what should be lying at the heart of both the IA and the EE. And for me, I want a student to come to me and tell me what they are passionate about, and we will find something in global politics that fits, if not their first passion, then their second passion. Because as I'm sure, those of you who've supervised EEs and IAs, is they can be a slog because these kids have a lot of stuff going on. And so the more we can keep them interested and the more they remain interested in what they're doing, the easier it'll be for them and the easier it'll be for us. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question entirely, but I think there is some latitude there. It just, at a broader sense, there is some latitude that doesn't qualify as double dipping in my mind. That's my personal opinion.
We have more questions. The next one is from Ben. What was the justification for removing the HL presentation component? Although it was logistically a bit challenging, it did give candidates an opportunity to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding in a different way, which I think was very valuable.
I agree. I agree, Ben. I understand, like in many of the curriculum development meetings, this was a topic of heated discussion amongst all of the teachers and the participants. And people from the IB came and explained their rationale behind doing it, and it all makes sense. I've always loved it because it is a real point of difference between global politics and all the other group threes, right? In terms of their internal assessment. However, we were always going to run initially, way back in the day, the HL, it was actually externally assessed. So it was the current format, but it was externally assessed, and it just became too much for the IB to do. As I alluded, we had this exponential growth of student numbers, and it just became just too impossible for it to be externally assessed, which is why it went to being internally assessed. But now we were stuck, unlike most subjects, we were stuck with 40% of an HL student's grades being internally assessed. We had 2 IAs, which is not consistent with their a student's experiences in other IB subjects, and so there was a discrepancy there. There was also some issue in terms of, some of the ways in which an oral presentation, a video oral presentation, might be assessed that is not actually in the rubric. So in terms of presentation, and the whole thing of, what counts as reading off a script and not reading off a script and things like that. So there was a little too much variability, I think. Like I don't have anything to do with examining the HLR extension, so I don't know for sure. But I think there was just a little bit too much variability and a little too much maybe students being assessed on their presentation skills, which is not actually what they're supposed to be getting assessed on. And so I think there were some issues there. So yeah, I'm as a teacher, I'm sorry to see the oral presentations go. I do like some of the changes. In particular, I like now the requirement of students to make those interconnections between the HL presentations. I like the fact between the HL topics. I like the fact that we've added in those extra 2. In essence, and this is what I would actually suggest, is there's nothing stopping us as teachers from continuing to do HL presentations in class. They just won't be externally assessed. So I certainly think that this is something that I'll end up doing, is around those, around the HL extensions, is even though everyone's going to be showing their evidence of their learning in an IB sense in a paper 3, it doesn't mean that we still can't have students develop those skills within a class. And then also that becomes a really lovely way for students to kind of share their research with other students, because as much as I try with my students is, yes, you are all going to sit in that exam hall by yourself, and yes, you will end up getting an IB score, which is yours, but we're kind of all in this together. And the more we can collaborate and the more we can build knowledge together, the easier it's going to be for all of us individually. So it's really kind of getting them to work together. So I still think there is a place within the global politics classroom for those kinds of oral presentations, even if they're not being internally assessed in the way they are now.
There's a question from Jacob, who's joining us today from the Philippines. And Jacob is asking, will the levels of analysis still be useful in the new curriculum, or is it obsolete?
No, I think they will still be valuable. They will still be valuable. I am struggling now to think whether they will be explicitly referenced, but clearly, like the engagement project is still very much based in the local level. I still think if we look at the current subject-specific material for the extended essay in global politics, and I've just been looking at it recently because of my current grade 11s, is one of the options in the extended essay is also making connections between local level phenomenon or how things play out at a local level and a national or regional or even an international level. And that might be a point of comparison or contrast in terms of analysis and evaluation in an extended essay. So there's still definitely place there. I'm not sure it's going to be quite as explicit as it was in the old guide. But that's a really interesting question, and I certainly don't want to pretend that that I have all the answers. So, and I'm still kind of coming to terms with myself. So that's something that I would actually have to kind of look at a little bit more. So, an excellent question. Thank you, Jacob.
There's a question from Lauren. How has the changing from engagement activity to engagement project changed the nature of the PIAIA?
Yeah, I think, again, if you look at also the criteria have changed, the assessment criteria have changed, that there is a little bit more of an explicit emphasis on skills, on actually planning out a project. So it's that idea, I guess it's one of those things, and we're seeing it in some of the other subjects too, and I think in some of the messaging we're getting from the IB is kind of, one of those 21st century skills is project management, and how do you plan something out and then bring it to fruition. And so one of the criterion in the PEA now, the activity, the project is the planning process. And can you see evidence in the final report of how this project was planned and then implemented and carried out? And so it's one of those kind of subtle but very significant shifts, because it's something that kids were always doing. I think if you were going to do well in the engagement activity, you had to project manage it, right? It was built into it, but it just wasn't assessed. And I think I think there was enough variation in the quality of reports and the quality of engagements and what students did and how they did it, that I think the IB wanted to make it explicit. So it's now something that we're going to teach explicitly, that's a skill you need to have.
Another question from Joseph. Why has the word count for HLSL changed for the engagement?
Yeah, it's part of that, one of the element of engagement. So what HL students are being required to do, and this is not, I can't speak for other Group 3 subjects, but this is not specific to global politics. I've seen it in economics where HL students, it's not enough for them just to understand and analyze kind of phenomenon or events. They actually have to start to propose possible policy solutions or ways of resolving a problem or something like that. They actually have to make recommendations. So it's kind of a higher order thinking that the IB is starting to expect HL students, at least in the Group 3, to be able to do. So I think this is a positive change. So that's why the extra 400 words has been added for HL students, because HL students are expected to do more than SL students. Are expected to have maybe a deeper understanding and to have thought a little bit more about, okay, well, I've done all this analysis, I've done this evaluation, okay, what now? And so actually starting to put into practice some of their analysis. So again, it's one of those things that I tell my kids, I always have a long game approach to teaching. So I'm preparing them for an IB exam at the end of the 2 years. I'm preparing them to be successful at university. So these are some of the things that will help them at university, kind of thinking through things and, okay, so what does this all mean, and what could I do with the information that I have now, with the knowledge I have? And then beyond university, right? These are the kind of skills that you would need either in the workplace or just as kind of as a citizen in wherever you end up finding yourself, so that you are actually able to put into action your knowledge. That's an excellent question.
There is another question from Nadine. For the HL paper, how should we prepare students? Is it the same as the HL extension, in which they research and come up with a case study, or is there a specific content to go over?
I wouldn't necessarily say there's specific content, because I think this is the idea, much like the current HL oral extension, it's students pick the topic, right? I don't, at least, and maybe other classes do it slightly differently, where maybe you would have a common topic that we're all going to do, And so you can kind of maybe do that for the first one, just to kind of give people an idea of how do you do your research and how would you present those findings and what do you need to do. But at the end of the day, the global political challenges should be something that a student has chosen for themselves. So I don't think that's different. I will say, I think that the chapter that Carolina wrote on the HL extension topics in the book would be helpful as kind of a starting point to kind of give some material for students to start with, kind of a springboard into their research. But at the end of the day, it's student directed. They have to pick the topic. They have to put in a GPC in one of the global political challenges. The major difference between the current system and the paper 3 is that explicit requirement for students to make those interconnections. So that's going to be the thing. I think it's going to be slightly different about the teaching process, is really constantly encouraging students to make those interconnections between, okay, well, this is happening in the GPC of security. Well, how might that be related to borders or to identity or to technology? And to be able to see how there's that interplay between different GPCs and different case studies. So it would probably be, and again, I'm kind of going out here on a bit of a limb because I'm still working through this myself. So I'm just kind of talking out loud, is I would think students would pick a topic, start to develop a case study, and then within that case study, they're identifying different global political challenges that fit. And they can maybe, there would be like 3 or 4. It's very unlikely that there'll only be 2. More likely than not, you're going to have multiple, but it's about figuring out where the strongest interconnections are, or where the most meaningful interconnections are to the individual students. So a lot of this, and I recognize that's quite daunting because it can be quite a fluid approach. And again, this is one of the reasons why, I probably wouldn't start introducing the GPCs, the case studies, too early in the course. I'd introduce them just so that they knew what they all were. But in terms of actually starting to develop those case studies, that's probably going to come a little bit later, once they've started to have a better feel for how global politics works, but then also starting to feel more comfortable with making those interconnections. Because I think a lot of students, at least my experience, come out of grade 10, and I don't know if anybody else, we do the IGCSEs, and I find that a lot of that is very content driven. And so students just come in saying, okay, tell me what I need to know. Tell me what I need to know. And they have a little bit of a period of discomfort with me because I'm like, you have to make those connections, right? I can't tell you what you need to know because you need to start to figure that out for yourself and start to figure out, well, how are all these things linked together? So I'm not really sure that's, again, I'm sorry, I'm not providing entirely satisfactory answers because I'm still trying to figure out some of this myself, to be honest. I'm just going to cough. Excuse me.
Now we are at time, but there are still 3 questions to be answered. So I think maybe we'll do another one and then we'll do the following 2 separately. So the next one is from Sophia. And Sophia is asking, how does a new global politics teacher work on cases, real world examples? Does the teacher choose which cases to teach in class?
Yeah, it's a good question. And this was the con to the option that I think I'm going to do. It requires a bit of work up front. I'm not saying you necessarily have to have entirely complete and streamlined case studies ready to go at the start. But the way I'm thinking I'm going to do it is I will create 4 to 6 case studies. And I've started to create like a little Google Doc where I'm throwing in ideas. So for instance, China's rise, and then you can figure out, well, okay, that's development and sustainability through the Belt and Road Initiative. That is peace and conflict through the South China Sea, the disputes in the South China Sea. That is kind of rights and justice through the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. There's all, so you can figure out where it kind of fits. But then it's a lot of it is going to be legwork of scaffolding that case study, right? Because maybe if you've got students coming out of an MYP, they may have had a different experience. But I know that my students coming into grade 11 next year will not have had much exposure to a case study methodology. So in my first term, I would be kind of introducing and modeling first of all, cases, the difference between an example, a case, and a case study, which is something you can find in the guide and is also in our textbook. But linking all of those, showing the difference between them and kind of building to a case study. And then what I would do is have 4 to 6 kind of ready to go, but with the flexibility within them that, as developments happen or as students kind of say, well, what about this? To give them that freedom to kind of go down different paths as well. So it's a difficult question. I will admit it will be, for me, it will be a lot of work up front, but I think it will pay off in the end.
Thank you, Michael. And I think we need to conclude the webinar now, but Tina and Lauren and Sharon, I can see your questions in chat. So what we will do, I'll make note of your questions and then we'll go back to you separately. Perhaps we'll email back the answers. That's okay with Michael. Awesome. So thank you very much. Pardon?
Love everybody's questions. Thank you very much for those.
Thank you very much for all your questions. That was great. And we hope you've enjoyed the webinar today. Just a couple of things before we are all on our way. We really will appreciate your help with filling in the post-webinar survey. Just let Michael know the amazing work he's done today. And also just a little reminder, the recording from the webinar will be available on our website in the next few days, but we will be in touch with a link to where it's located on our website so that you can go back and watch it again or share it with your colleagues. So thanks again to all of you for attending today. Have a good end of the day and good end to this week. And yeah, thanks again. Bye. Bye.